It's funny how a moment you've imagined 1,000 times can shatter into a nightmare in an instant. My wedding day, the day I thought would be the beginning of a perfect life with the woman I loved, was anything but perfect. As I stood at the altar, feeling the weight of every vow I was about to make, Sarah stood beside me, radiant in her gown. Her smile looked perfect, but now I wonder if it had been rehearsed. The ceremony started beautifully. My parents beamed with pride. My friends exchanged knowing winks, and the air was thick with the kind of joy you only find at weddings. I should have known something was off when Sarah's hand trembled in mine. I chalked it up to nerves. Who wouldn't be nervous on their wedding day? But the tremble wasn't nerves. It was guilt, betrayal, and something far colder. The priest's words echoed in the hall. "Do you, Sarah, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her lips parted, but the words that came out weren't the ones anyone expected. She stepped back, releasing my hand, and looked at me, not with love, but with pity. "I can't do this," she said. For a moment, I thought she meant she couldn't handle the emotions of the day. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But then she turned, her voice steady and clear, and pointed toward the audience. "This is Andrew's moment now." The room froze. My brother Andrew stood, his confident smirk carving its way across his face as he walked toward us. I stared at him, and then at Sarah, unable to process what I'd just heard. Was this a joke? Some kind of bizarre prank? But the way Andrew stood tall, the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she looked at him, it all hit me like a sledgehammer. "Why don't you join the audience, Michael?" Sarah added, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is where you belong." Her words gutted me. The world around me became a blur of whispers and gasps as the guests processed what had just happened. I was frozen in place, a spectacle in my own tragedy. People I'd known for years, the same people who had congratulated me on my engagement, now looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief. My parents were too shocked to move, my friends too horrified to speak. Andrew, my alpha brother, the golden child who could do no wrong, stood beside Sarah as if he belonged there. His smirk deepened, and I wanted nothing more than to knock it off his face. But I didn't. Not yet. No, I needed to keep my composure. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room, every judgment and assumption. Losing control now would hand them the victory they craved. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. Sarah tilted her head, her expression almost mocking. "It's no joke, Michael. Andrew and we're in love. This wedding was a mistake." Andrew chimed in, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Step aside, little brother. You wouldn't want to ruin our big day." Our big day. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming for me to lash out, but I forced myself to breathe. My entire life had been a series of battles against Andrew, fighting for recognition, for approval, for a place in the family that wasn't overshadowed by his larger-than-life presence. And now, here he was, stealing the one thing I thought was mine alone. But this wasn't the time for anger. No, anger would only make me look like the fool they wanted me to be. If they thought I'd crumble under the weight of their betrayal, they were wrong. I straightened my back, adjusted my tie, and smiled. An expression so calm it wiped the smirk off Andrew's face. "By all means," I said, stepping aside and gesturing to the priest. "The stage is yours. Enjoy it." The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some standing in shock, others rushing to me with concerned murmurs. But I didn't pay them any mind. I walked calmly to an empty seat in the front row, my head held high, and sat down. If Sarah and Andrew thought they'd humiliated me, they hadn't seen anything yet. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah hesitate. Andrew's confident posture faltered. They expected me to lash out, to cry, to storm out of the church in a fit of rage. But instead, I was a statue of composure, an immovable force amidst the chaos they'd created. As they fumbled to explain themselves to the priest, as the guests continued to murmur and point, I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They thought they'd won, that they'd stripped me of my dignity and walked away victorious. But I had something they didn't: patience. And when my next move came, they wouldn't know what hit them. Looking back, I can't say the betrayal came out of nowhere. No, the signs were there, subtle but insidious, like cracks in a mirror that only become obvious when the glass shatters. But when you're in love, you're blind to the small things, too busy convincing yourself that everything is perfect to notice the fractures forming. Sarah and I met through a mutual friend. From the moment she walked into the room, I was smitten. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world. Her laugh infectious, her smile intoxicating. I fell hard, and before long, she was the center of my universe. My friends warned me that things were moving too fast, that Sarah was too good to be true. I brushed them off, calling them jealous or overprotective. I trusted her completely, and for a while, it seemed like she trusted me too. Then there was Andrew, my older brother. Andrew, the golden child, the man who could do no wrong. Where I was careful and methodical, Andrew was bold and impulsive. He had this magnetic charm that drew people in, but it also masked his darker side. Growing up, I'd lived in his shadow, always striving for the approval that came so easily to him. But as we got older, I thought we'd moved past the rivalry. I thought we were finally brothers, not competitors. Andrew was around a lot in the months leading up to the wedding. He was always stopping by, offering unsolicited advice about the venue or the guest list, cracking jokes about how he'd make a better groom. "Relax, Mikey," he'd say, patting me on the back. "I'm just kidding." And I'd laugh, because Andrew was always joking. At least, I thought he was. But there were moments that didn't sit right with me. Moments when I'd catch him and Sarah exchanging looks or laughing about something I wasn't in on. I told myself I was imagining things. Sarah loved me. Andrew was my brother. Why would they ever betray me? The truth started to creep in slowly, like shadows stretching at dusk. Sarah began acting distant, her excuses for avoiding me piling up. "Work's been crazy," she'd say, or "I just need some space to decompress." I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was just stressed about the wedding. But the way she looked at me, it wasn't the same. Her smile no longer reached her eyes, and her touch felt like an obligation rather than a desire. Andrew's behavior changed too. He stopped with the jokes and started offering Sarah more attention than I was comfortable with. At family dinners, he'd pull out her chair or pour her wine. Small gestures that shouldn't have meant anything but did. When I confronted him about it, he laughed it off. "You're being paranoid, little brother," he said, his grin smug and unbothered. Sarah's like family now. But the worst part? I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I was overthinking things, that the nagging feeling in my gut was nothing more than pre-wedding jitters. After all, why would Sarah choose Andrew over me? We were planning a life together. She loved me, or at least, she said she did. Then came the night before the wedding. Sarah was out with her bridesmaids, celebrating her last night as a single woman. I stayed home, going over the vows I'd written and double-checking the details for the big day. Andrew dropped by unannounced, a bottle of whiskey in hand and a smug look on his face. "One last drink before you're a married man," he said, pouring us each a glass. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us palpable. I wanted to ask him about Sarah, about the strange moments I'd noticed, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd say. Maybe I didn't want to give voice to my doubts. Instead, I raised my glass and said, "Here's to tomorrow." Andrew clinked his glass against mine, his smirk widening. "To tomorrow," he said. But there was something in his tone, something that made my stomach churn. It wasn't a toast. It was a promise. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah and Andrew. Their faces too close, their laughter too intimate. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. Tomorrow would be perfect. Sarah and I would say our vows, and all of this uncertainty would fade away. But deep down, I knew. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but I knew. The cracks in the mirror were no longer invisible. They were spreading, threatening to shatter everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. The night before my wedding should have been a time of excitement, maybe even a few last-minute nerves. Instead, It became the moment everything I thought I knew unraveled. It was late, the kind of late where silence fills every corner of the house. I was alone, sitting at the dining table, staring at the vows I'd written for Sarah. They felt like lies now, every promise a hollow echo of something I wasn't sure existed anymore. I tried to shake off the feeling, the nagging unease that had been building for weeks. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting the stress of the wedding get to me. But as much as I wanted to dismiss it, the doubts gnawed at me, relentless and cruel. My phone buzzed. A simple notification. Sarah had left hers behind earlier in her rush to meet her bridesmaids. I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe it was the universe nudging me, or maybe it was just that little voice inside me screaming for answers. Whatever the reason, I found myself staring at her phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. The lock screen didn't stop me. A code wasn't necessary between us, or so I thought. She trusted me with everything, or so I thought. The moment the messages opened, I realized trust had been a one-sided affair. There it was, in black and white. Messages between Sarah and Andrew. Messages that weren't just flirtatious or inappropriate. No, these were confessions of love, of passion, of betrayal so deep it felt like a knife twisting in my chest with every word I read. Can you believe how easy it's been? Sarah had written, "He suspects nothing. Tomorrow, it'll all fall into place." Andrew's response hit harder than I could have imagined. Of course. He's always been predictable, so desperate to be loved. This is our moment, Sarah. After tomorrow, he's out of the picture, and it's just us. But the one that shattered me completely? I can't wait to see his face when he realizes. It'll be perfect. Perfect. The word echoed in my mind, mocking me. My wedding day, the moment I dreamed about, wasn't meant to be a celebration of love. It was a spectacle of humiliation, a stage where I was the unknowing fool. I wanted to stop reading, to throw the phone across the room and pretend I hadn't seen it. But my hand refused to let go, and my eyes refused to stop. There were more messages, ones that made it clear just how long this had been going on. Sarah and Andrew weren't a recent fling. They'd been planning this for months. Every kiss, every whispered, "I love you," every shared moment between Sarah and me had been a lie, a distraction while she plotted her betrayal. Then I saw it. The message that left no doubt about the depth of their cruelty. Once we're married, his money will make everything easier. He's the stepping stone to the life we deserve. My money, my love, my trust, all tools in their twisted game. They'd turn my life, my future, into nothing more than a means to their selfish ends. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of their betrayal crushed me, pressing down until I thought I'd collapse under it. My mind raced with questions. How long had they been lying to me? Why would Sarah agree to marry me if she didn't love me? Was Andrew's presence in my life always a shadow, a reminder that I'd never be enough? Anger bubbled beneath the surface, hot and furious, threatening to consume me. But I couldn't let it take over, not yet. If I confronted them now, they'd find a way to twist it, to make me look like the bad guy. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed a plan. I set the phone down, my hands trembling, and took a deep breath. They thought they'd won, that their betrayal was a secret they'd carry to the altar and beyond. But they underestimated me. They saw me as the younger brother, the pushover, the one who always came second. They thought I'd break under the weight of their lies. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. I stayed up the rest of the night, my mind spinning with ideas. Confronting them would be too easy, too quick. They needed to feel what I felt: confusion, humiliation, and the sharp sting of betrayal. And the wedding? That would be my stage, not theirs. If they wanted a spectacle, I'd give them one. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. All it needed to do was show them that they'd picked the wrong person to underestimate. I wasn't the fool they thought I was, and by the time the day was over, they'd know it. As I put on my suit, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see the man I was yesterday, the hopeful groom excited for his future. That man was gone, replaced by someone colder, sharper, and more determined. Today wasn't just my wedding day. It was the beginning of my revenge. The morning of my wedding started like any other. The sky was clear, The sun shone brightly, and the air carried the crisp excitement of new beginnings. But for me, there was no joy. Beneath my polished suit and steady smile, a storm raged, hidden from everyone. This wasn't a wedding day. It was the battleground where I would reclaim my dignity. I arrived early at the venue, greeted by family and friends who were oblivious to the turmoil inside me. They smiled, they laughed, they congratulated me. I returned their kindness with practiced ease, nodding at their well wishes while my mind replayed the messages I had read the night before. I wondered how many of them had seen it too. How many had known about Sarah and Andrew's betrayal? The thought made my stomach churn, but I shoved it aside. Today wasn't about them. It wasn't even about Sarah or Andrew. It was about me taking control of a story they thought they could write. Sarah arrived shortly after, glowing in her wedding gown, her veil framing a face that now seemed unfamiliar. How could someone who looked so angelic carry such darkness in her heart? She smiled at me as she walked down the aisle, and I matched her expression, knowing my calmness would unsettle her more than any outburst could. She didn't know I'd seen the messages. She didn't know what I had planned, and that ignorance was my weapon. The ceremony began, the priest's voice filling the room with words that once held meaning for me but now felt like hollow echoes. I could feel Sarah's hand in mine, steady and soft, a stark contrast to the trembling anger I suppressed. Andrew sat in the front row, his smug grin barely concealed as he watched the proceedings. I could almost hear his thoughts. Just a little longer, Michael. Soon, it'll all be over. The priest turned to Sarah. Do you, Sarah, take Michael to be your lawfully wedded husband? Her hesitation was barely noticeable, but I caught it. She glanced at Andrew, and that split second was enough to confirm everything I already knew. She opened her mouth, but the words that came out weren't the ones anyone expected. I can't do this. The room froze. My heart should have shattered, but it didn't. I'd been preparing for this moment all night, and the chaos that followed was exactly what I was counting on. Whispers rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging stunned glances as Sarah stepped back, releasing my hand. I'm sorry, Michael, she said, though there wasn't a shred of remorse in her tone. Her eyes darted to Andrew, who stood from his seat like a king ascending his throne. This is Andrew's moment now. The gasps were audible, a wave of shock washing over the audience as Andrew walked toward us. His confidence was palpable, his smirk infuriating. He placed a hand on Sarah's back, pulling her close in a show of possession that made my blood boil. Why don't you join the audience, little brother? Andrew said, his voice dripping with mockery. This is where you belong. Sarah nodded, her gaze meeting mine with an unsettling mix of pity and arrogance. It's true, Michael. Andrew and I are in love. This wedding was a mistake. A mistake. That's what she called it. The vows I had written, the dreams I had shared with her, the life I had planned. It was all reduced to a mistake. But I didn't react. Not the way they expected me to. I didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't crumble under the weight of their betrayal. Instead, I smiled. By all means, I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the altar. The stage is yours. The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some standing in disbelief, others rushing toward me with concerned murmurs. I ignored them, walking calmly to an empty seat in the front row. I could feel every eye in the room on me, waiting for me to break, to lash out, to do something, anything, that would justify the cruelty of what they had done. But I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I sat down, my back straight, my head held high. Sarah and Andrew stood at the altar, visibly thrown off by my composure. They had expected a meltdown, a scene, maybe even a fight. Instead, they got nothing. And that nothing was everything. The priest looked unsure, glancing between me, Sarah, and Andrew. I'm not sure what to do here, he stammered, clearly unprepared for the spectacle unfolding before him. Proceed, I said, my voice calm but firm. Let them have their moment. Sarah and Andrew exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time, I saw cracks in their confidence. My calmness unnerved them, disrupted their plans. This wasn't the humiliation they had envisioned. This wasn't the reaction they'd banked on. As they fumbled to explain themselves to the priest, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. I leaned back in my chair, watching the chaos unfold with a sense of detachment. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Sitting in the front row of my own wedding as my bride stood with my brother at the altar was surreal. The whispers, the stares, the chaotic disbelief. It all swirled around me, but I stayed calm. They thought I'd been defeated. They thought this was their grand finale. Little did they know, it was only the overture to their downfall. Sarah and Andrew, so confident in their treachery, had no idea what I had planned. As I sat there, the shock in the room began to morph into anger. Not mine, but from the guests. My parents, once frozen in disbelief, were now staring daggers at Andrew. Sarah's parents whispered furiously, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The tension in the room was palpable, and I let it simmer. Every second of their discomfort was a gift. Andrew, ever the showman, couldn't resist addressing the room. He stepped forward, smug and self-assured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his arms like he was delivering a keynote speech. "I know this isn't what you expected, but love has a way of finding its path, doesn't it?" The audacity. I clenched my jaw but kept my composure. The guests were too stunned to respond, their shock rendering them silent. Sarah stood by his side, her gaze flitting nervously between him and the audience. She wasn't as sure of herself as he was. Her hand trembled slightly, the same way it had earlier. Good. Let the fear set in. I waited a moment, letting Andrew bask in his delusion before I stood. All eyes turned to me, the betrayed groom, the one they expected to lash out or crumble. Instead, I adjusted my tie, stepped forward, and spoke with a calmness that cut through the tension like a knife. "Andrew," I began, my voice steady, "you're absolutely right. Love does find its path. And today, it found yours and Sarah's. But I think our guests deserve a little context, don't you?" Andrew's smirk faltered. Sarah's eyes widened. The cracks were forming. I could feel it. "I wasn't sure whether I should say this today," I continued, turning to address the crowd. "But since the truth has already started pouring out, why not let it flow?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapping the screen to cue the prepared presentation. The projector at the back of the room hummed to life, casting a bright light on the wall behind the altar. The first image appeared, a screenshot of a text message exchange between Sarah and Andrew, complete with timestamps and dates. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the words came into focus. "He's clueless," Sarah had written. "Tomorrow, it's all us." Andrew's response followed, "Good. Let him play the fool. Once it's over, we're set for life." The silence was deafening. Andrew's confidence evaporated, his face paling as the magnitude of the situation began to dawn on him. Sarah took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth as though to stifle a scream. "Andrew and Sarah didn't just fall in love," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. "They plotted, they schemed, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But I did." The slides continued, each one more damning than the last. Photos of secret meetings, bank transfers that tied Andrew's financial schemes to Sarah's involvement, and, finally, the piece de resistance. Sarah's confession about using my money to fund their dream life. "This wedding wasn't about love," I said, turning to face them directly. "It was about greed, about betrayal, and about two people who thought they could manipulate me, use me, and discard me like yesterday's trash." Andrew tried to interject, raising a hand as though to stop me. "Michael, let's not do this here." "We can." "Do what, Andrew?" I snapped, my voice finally rising, sharp and cutting. "Continue the charade? Pretend you weren't standing here trying to humiliate me in front of everyone? No, today is the day you face the consequences." The guests erupted. Some were shouting, others were whispering furiously, and a few stormed out in disgust. Sarah's parents looked mortified, their faces buried in their hands. My mother, normally the quiet one, stood up and pointed a finger at Andrew. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you do this to your own brother?" Andrew looked like a deer caught in headlights, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Sarah was crying now, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her face. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The final slide appeared on the screen. A photo of Andrew with another woman, his real fiancée. The room collectively gasped, and I delivered the final blow. "Let me introduce you to Catherine," I said, pointing to the photo. "The woman Andrew's been engaged to for 6 months. Funny how loyalty doesn't seem to be his strong suit." Andrew stammered, his face ghostly pale. "Michael, I can explain." "Don't bother," I interrupted. "The wedding is over. You and Sarah wanted your moment? Well, congratulations. You got it. Enjoy the fallout." I turned to the guests, many of whom were still too stunned to speak. "Thank you all for coming. I apologize for the spectacle, but I think we can all agree it's better this way." With that, I walked out, leaving the chaos behind me. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt an odd sense of peace. They thought they'd won, but I'd turned their betrayal into their downfall. And that was just the beginning. When I walked out of that wedding, I knew I'd left behind a hurricane of chaos, but I didn't expect it to spiral as it did. The guests, stunned into silence during my presentation, finally found their voices, and they weren't kind. Sarah and Andrew, who'd thought they could turn my life into their twisted fairy tale, now stood exposed under the harsh spotlight of truth. I didn't have to witness the fallout firsthand to know what happened. I heard it all later. People couldn't stop talking about it. Apparently, the second I left the room, the guests began hurling questions, accusations, and disgusted remarks at the so-called bride and my disgrace of a brother. Sarah, dressed in what was supposed to be her moment of glory, became the subject of ridicule and scorn. "What were you thinking?" someone shouted. "How could you betray him like this?" another demanded. Sarah tried to stammer out an explanation, but the room wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Her tears, which might have softened hearts on any other day, fell unnoticed. This wasn't a room filled with sympathizers. It was a room full of people who now saw her as a manipulator, a liar, and, perhaps worst of all, a fool who thought she could have it all without consequence. Andrew didn't fare much better. His cocky grin was long gone, replaced by a pale, panicked expression as he attempted to regain control. "Let's calm down," he reportedly said, holding up his hands like a man trying to tame a wildfire. But the crowd wasn't having it. "You calm down," one of my friends yelled. "How could you do this to your own brother?" Andrew's smug facade cracked under the weight of the outrage. My parents were among the loudest voices in the room. My father, a man who had always prided himself on keeping his composure, reportedly stood up and unleashed years of pent-up frustration. "I can't believe I raised a son who would stoop this low," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You've embarrassed this family, Andrew. You've embarrassed yourself." My mother, normally the peacekeeper, chimed in with tears streaming down her face. "We gave you everything, Andrew. Everything. And this is how you repay us? By betraying your own blood?" Sarah's parents weren't silent either. Her father, red-faced and fuming, turned to her with a fury I'd never imagined him capable of. "You've disgraced us, Sarah," he spat. "What kind of daughter are you? Throwing away a good man for this?" He pointed at Andrew, who flinched as if the words were physical blows. Sarah, overwhelmed by the hostility, reportedly sank to the floor, her veil crumpling around her as she sobbed. For once, she had no clever retorts, no defiance. She was a broken shell of the confident woman who had thought she could outwit me. The other guests joined in. My friends, my colleagues, even distant relatives I barely knew. All of them took turns expressing their anger and disbelief. The tide had turned so quickly that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. I later learned that one of my uncles, a no-nonsense kind of guy, walked up to Andrew and said, "You've always been a snake, but this is a new low, even for you." Then, as if to punctuate his disgust, he grabbed his wife's hand and left, loudly declaring, "I won't waste another minute watching this circus." It wasn't just words either. People began walking out in droves, leaving Sarah and Andrew standing there, abandoned in the ruins of what was supposed to be their triumphant moment. The room, which had been full of life and celebration when I arrived, became an empty shell, echoing with the sounds of footsteps and muttered curses as guests left in disgust. By the time the chaos settled, only a handful of people remained, mostly those too curious or too stunned to leave. Sarah and Andrew, still reeling from the public flogging, reportedly sat in silence, their carefully crafted world crumbling around them. But it didn't end there. Oh no, the humiliation was only beginning. Word spread quickly. By the time I got home, I'd already received several calls and messages from friends who couldn't wait to tell me how everything had played out. Social media lit up with posts from guests who, despite their outrage, couldn't resist documenting the drama. Pictures of Sarah crying, Andrew looking panicked, and snippets of the projector presentation began circulating online. Sarah and Andrew's betrayal wasn't just a private scandal anymore. It was public. Their names were dragged through the mud, their reputations irreparably damaged. Sarah, once admired for her charm and beauty, became a cautionary tale about greed and deception. Andrew, who had always thrived on his charisma, found himself shunned by the very people who had once adored him. The fallout was swift and brutal. Sarah lost her job within days, her employer citing the public disgrace as a reason for termination. Andrew's business connections dried up overnight. No one wanted to be associated with a man so publicly branded as untrustworthy. And me? I stayed quiet. I let the world do what it would to them, knowing that their downfall was no longer in my hands. They dug their own graves. I'd simply handed them the shovels. By the time the chaos at the wedding had subsided, Sarah and Andrew were left to pick up the pieces of the disaster they had created. It wasn't just the humiliation of being exposed in front of friends and family. It was the ripple effect that followed. What they had assumed would be a moment of triumph had turned into a public unraveling of their lives. The fallout began almost immediately. Social media became a battlefield of opinions and gossip. Photos and videos from the wedding were shared widely, with captions like, "The most shocking wedding ever," and "When betrayal takes center stage." The comments were ruthless. People dissected every detail, from Sarah's tear-streaked face to Andrew's pale, stunned expression. They had become infamous overnight, their names synonymous with scandal and betrayal. Sarah's life fell apart faster than I could have imagined. Within days, her employer contacted her to inform her that her behavior had brought negative attention to the company. She was fired without ceremony, left to deal with not only the shame but also the financial strain. Her carefully curated image of success and charm had been shattered, replaced by the perception of someone who had gambled everything and lost. Andrew, too, found himself cornered by the consequences of his actions. His business associates, many of whom had been guests at the wedding, cut ties with him immediately. They couldn't risk being associated with someone whose personal scandal had become public fodder. His investments began to crumble as word spread of his untrustworthiness. Deals fell through, clients pulled out, and creditors started calling. Andrew, who had always been the golden child, was now tarnished beyond repair. The fallout wasn't limited to their careers. Their social circles disintegrated as well. Friends who had once celebrated their charisma and charm turned their backs on them. Invitations to events stopped coming. Sarah and Andrew became pariahs, their betrayal a stain no one wanted to be associated with. Even the friends who had supported them in secret began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk being implicated in their mess. And then there were the personal consequences. Sarah and Andrew's relationship, built on lies and deceit, couldn't withstand the pressure. They started fighting almost immediately after the wedding. Blame was thrown back and forth like a game of hot potato. Sarah accused Andrew of pushing her into the plan, while Andrew claimed it had been Sarah's idea all along. Their love unraveled as quickly as their lives had. But the most crushing blow came when Catherine, Andrew's real fiancée, stepped into the picture. She wasn't just furious, she was out for blood. Catherine, a sharp and determined woman, had been blindsided by Andrew's betrayal. She wasted no time filing a lawsuit against him, seeking damages for emotional distress and financial fraud. Her testimony, coupled with the evidence I'd shared at the wedding, painted a devastating picture of Andrew's character. Sarah didn't escape Catherine's wrath, either. Catherine made it clear that she held Sarah just as responsible for the chaos, and her testimony in court was scathing. "You thought you could steal my life," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "But now you'll have to live with the consequences." As for me, I kept my distance from the storm I had unleashed. I focused on rebuilding my life, but I couldn't help but hear about the fallout. People kept calling, eager to share the latest updates on Sarah and Andrew's downfall. It wasn't out of malice that I listened. It was closure. Every new piece of information was a reminder that I'd made the right decision to expose them. One day, Sarah showed up at my door. She looked nothing like the confident woman I had once known. Her eyes were hollow, her posture defeated. She begged for a chance to explain, to apologize, to make things right. "Michael, I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I let greed and Andrew blind me. Please, I'm sorry." I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and pity. She had been a part of my life, someone I had loved and trusted. But her betrayal wasn't something I could forgive. Not now, maybe not ever. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, "you didn't just betray me. You destroyed the trust we built. And for what? A fantasy that fell apart the moment it began? I can't fix what you broke, and I won't try." Andrew never came to see me. He didn't have the courage. The last I heard, he had fled the city, leaving Sarah to deal with the aftermath alone. His debts continued to pile up, and with no allies left, he was forced to sell off what little he had to avoid legal action. The man who had always lived in the spotlight was now hiding in the shadows. As time passed, the story of Sarah and Andrew became a cautionary tale. People whispered about them at parties, used their names as warnings against greed and betrayal. They had become the architects of their own misery, and their lives would never be the same. And me? I moved on, stronger and wiser than before. Their betrayal had hurt me, yes, but it had also taught me the value of resilience. I wasn't defined by what they did to me. I was defined by how I rose above it. And as I closed that chapter of my life, I knew one thing for certain. The best revenge wasn't just their downfall, it was my success. In the days and weeks that followed the wedding, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a battlefield, surveying the ruins left behind. The chaos, the betrayal, and the humiliation. They were all in the past now, but their echoes lingered. Yet, instead of feeling defeated, I felt lighter. It was as if the weight of Sarah and Andrew's lies had been lifted from my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I could finally breathe. The road to recovery wasn't easy. At first, the anger was all-consuming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, Sarah's look of pity and Andrew's smug grin. But as the days turned into weeks, the anger gave way to something else, clarity. I started to realize that their betrayal, as painful as it was, had been a blessing in disguise. They hadn't destroyed me, they'd freed me. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened, trying to understand how I could have missed the signs. There were moments of self-doubt, times when I questioned my judgment and wondered if I'd been too trusting, too naive. But I also realized that their actions said more about them than they did about me. Sarah and Andrew had chosen deception and greed, and their choices had led them to ruin. I wasn't responsible for their downfall, they were. In the aftermath, life moved on, though not without its challenges. The public spectacle of the wedding meant that I couldn't completely escape the whispers and stares. People would approach me with awkward smiles, offering sympathy or expressing their shock at what had happened. Some even congratulated me for the way I'd handled it, calling me brave or strong. I appreciated their words, but what they didn't realize was that my strength didn't come from the exposure. It came from surviving it. Professionally, things took an unexpected turn. News of the wedding fiasco spread far beyond the guests who had witnessed it, and while I feared it would damage my reputation, the opposite happened. Clients and colleagues respected the way I had confronted the betrayal head-on. They saw me as someone who could handle adversity with grace, and in some strange twist of fate, my career thrived because of it. Meanwhile, Sarah and Andrew's lives continued to unravel. Sarah, once the picture of confidence and charm, became a shadow of her former self. She tried to apologize again, sending me letters and messages that I never responded to. Her words were filled with regret, but they couldn't undo the damage she'd caused. Andrew, on the other hand, disappeared completely. He had fled the city, his debts mounting and his reputation in shambles. The man who had once lived for the spotlight was now hiding from it. One day, as I was organizing my apartment, I came across the vows I had written for Sarah. I held the paper in my hands, reading the words that had once meant so much to me. They felt foreign now, like a relic from a different life. Without hesitation, I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. It wasn't an act of bitterness. It was a symbol of letting go. The real turning point came when I decided to focus on myself. For years, I had been living in the shadows of others. Andrew's shadow, Sarah's expectations, and it was time to step into the light. I threw myself into my work, took up hobbies I'd abandoned, and reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self-worth. Looking back, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in exposing Sarah and Andrew or watching their lives fall apart. It was in rediscovering my own strength. They had tried to tear me down, but all they'd done was show me what I was capable of. Their betrayal had been a fire, and I had walked through it, emerging stronger on the other side. I won't lie and say there aren't scars. Betrayal leaves its mark, and trust isn't something I give lightly anymore. But those scars are a part of me now, a reminder of what I've overcome. They don't define me, but they've shaped me, and for that, I'm grateful. In the end, the story of Sarah and Andrew became a distant memory, a tale people whispered about at parties or used as a cautionary example. But for me, it was more than that. It was the moment I stopped being a passive participant in my own life. It was the moment I took control. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the man who was betrayed. I see someone who survived, who thrived, and who refused to let the actions of others define him. And as for Sarah and Andrew, they can keep their betrayal, their regrets, and their ruined lives. I've moved on, and the life I'm building now is better than anything they could have imagined. My greatest revenge isn't their downfall. It's my happiness.